Okay. Well, welcome back, minors. My name is Amber Johnston, and I'm a counselor here in Student Wellbeing.
And my name is Traci Krygiel, and I'm a counselor here in Student Wellbeing. And it's time for your morning cup of joe.
Well, dating is hard. In the last 30 years with the rise of the internet, we've seen a drastic change in the way that people date. It used to be that two people met each other in class or through friends, and they asked each other to go out on a date, and then bing, bang, boom, stuff happened. That seems like it was a much simpler time now that for most people. And now that we have online dating, we shop for partners much in the same way we select a new pair of shoes. And it's often to negative results. I know I hear a great deal of frustration regarding the apps, and not only that, but the attitudes that people are having about dating in general.
I can resonate that, Amber. So it seems to be an attitude that most people are treating the people that they're dating as disposable.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's constant swiping that allows us to devalue potential partners and always feeling like there's a better match and it's just a swipe away.
Mm-hmm.
So to answer these questions and more, we brought together two faculty members here from S&T to discuss modern dating and some of the attitudes and beliefs that are going around right now. So I'm going to introduce you to our panelists. And our first panelist is Dr. Merilee Krueger. She's a teaching professor here in the Psychological Services Department. And Dr. Krueger has been a part of the Psychological Services Department for more than 30 years. And she's received numerous awards for teaching excellence and leadership. I've seen so many wonderful accolades about her,
Well,
so
thank you.
we're so glad to have her here. Her academic training and background are in cognitive developmental psychology. She teaches a variety of courses, including general psychology, educational psychology, psychology of the exceptional child, developmental psychology, cross-cultural psychology, and adolescent development. She also teaches classes in leadership for both undergraduate and graduate level students. She's an advisor to many of the psychology majors and is a faculty advisor for the International Honor Society in Psychology, which is the Psych-Hi, and the Department Social and Service Club. She obtained her bachelor's degree in psychology from Creighton University, her master's degree in developmental cognitive psychology from the University of Nebraska, and her doctorate of education from the University of Missouri in 2020. So we are so glad that you've joined us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And our second panelist is Dr. Jessica Cundiff. Dr. Cundiff joined the faculty of Missouri S&T in 2015 and is as an assistant professor and is now an associate professor and founding director of the advanced program, which is an exciting program, which started in 2022. In addition to conducting research, she teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in social psychology, social influence, general psychology, and good grief. I can't talk today sometimes. Psychology of gender. She is a social psychologist with expertise in the psychology of gender, stereotyping, and discrimination. Her research focuses on the psychological processes that contributed to the social inequality with an emphasis on subtle forms of biases that are often unintentional and seemingly minor, but yet consequential. Most recently, her work has focused on understanding gender gaps in STEM participation and developing strategies for increasing diversity and inclusion in the STEM fields. Dr. Cundiff obtained her bachelor's in psychology at the University of Texas in Austin, her master's in social psychology from Penn State, and her PhD in social psychology and women's studies from Penn State University as well. We are so honored to have you here as well, so welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Absolutely.
Well, today we're going to start the discussion with some prepared questions. But students, you can feel free to message in on the chat function, and we can address those questions to our panel once we're through with our prepared questions. So now let's get started. I'm seeing students who feel like they're never going to find a partner because they've not dated by the time that they're like 20 or 25. What is your observation as the normal ages that people typically start having relationships, developmentally speaking?
That's an interesting question because there is no perfect time, technically to begin a relationship, but we are seeing a shift developmentally that it used to be like, think of your grandparents and previous generations, people kind of had it all kind of figured out. By the time they were 18, that was kind of a milestone. We've added almost an extra stage of development now called emerging adulthood that goes from adolescence before we get into the reality, the hard stuff of being a grown-up. And so we're giving people are taking longer to finish school, jobs are requiring more education, and so we're pressing that out. And as a result, then, people are starting to date later, that there's more of a trend toward, I want to finish my education, I want to get settled, I want to have a job, and then I want to perhaps begin having a relationship. And so, yes, there is a developmental trend behind why we are seeing it later. Now, that doesn't take away a desire that I wish I had a partner, but there is science to back up why we are seeing it happening later.
So how do early relationships differ from those later ones and the more permanent relationships in how people meet partners and what kind of partners they're dating? And does development impact this process?
Oh, absolutely. If you think about Jean Piaget is a psychologist who says the way you think is very different. So the way I was explaining it in my classes is that think about how maybe your best friend was when you were a child. It was someone who lived next door, someone who had cool toys. Well, then as we get older and our cognition grows qualitatively, we start to see more elements that we want in a partner. And so as we get older, we're more capable of that. And so adults, young adults, emerging adults are more capable of knowing what they want in a relationship. They want loyalty. They want someone who can be a partner and have intimacy with them. Versus when you're younger, it's not as important. But as we evolve and we grow, that's when we start to see our needs be different and what we look for in a partner be very different.
Okay. So there's a lot of men who feel like the lack of dating experience is a detriment towards finding a partner in the future. And then they kind of feel like you get that women feel the opposite, like that too many dating partners is a deterrent to them in the future. What do you think on this dynamic?
Well, as far as dating, I'm not so sure, but we do know that there is a double standard in terms of sexual activity and sexual partners, that as much as we've tried to see a difference, that there is a double standard that men are, quote unquote, allowed to have more multiple partners, whereas women are looked more down upon if they have multiple sexual partners. And I would assume that the same thing would be mostly then true for dating. And so as far as a deterrent to them, I guess it goes to like a skill that you've practiced. It doesn't mean that if you start it later, you're not going to be good at it or that you can't still have things to offer in a relationship. Sometimes people date and date and date and date and never learn a thing from it. So it's not necessarily that I dated so much, I'm so good at this. That could definitely maybe be seen as a negative because I might think, well, why can't you settle down? Kind of a thing, rather than to say I'm so good at it because I've dated so many people for so long.
Okay.
So let's talk about modern changes in the dating practice. So do you feel like this generation is dating less than the previous ones?
Again, I think that goes back to what I said previously, the whole idea that our adolescence and our emerging adulthood are different. The expectations are different. Again, if you go back to a previous generation, people would say, by the time I was your age, I was married and had kids. And that's not the way that it is. And so that's a real difference in development. And sometimes we have a generational gap misunderstanding that an older generation, I know, like personal example, my parents are stunned and amazed that my 20-something children are not in serious relationships. It stuns them because by the time they were their age, they were married and probably already even had children. And so it's just a real generational shift that we as society have embraced. It's made up for, and we're also starting adolescence earlier and all those different things. And so it's, I would say, yes, that it's not as, and we don't, like when previous generations were more dated more in high school, and we're seeing less and less of that. And so there is a definite shift that I would say they seem to be dating less. Yeah, I would say so.
I've actually read some statistics where they're saying that fewer people are looking for a partner in the younger generations than were previously.
Yeah, I've read the similar thing. It's a definite shift. Things have changed in terms of what society expects of us, and then in terms of what we expect of ourselves. Definitely, most definitely.
So it sounds like you answered that next question.
Yeah.
Okay. So what about the idea that we are treating partners as more disposable in the past? What did you think about that question?
Well, I'm not so sure if we can make a broad statement saying that they all are, but sometimes when you have too much choice, they talk about something in psychology called choice overload, and we in a society are expecting that. It's no more to say, I want to go to a restaurant that has a huge menu. They only have 3 things on their menu. We want that, we think. And yet, once we have too many choices, the option is there to say, oh, well, because there's so many choices out there, I shouldn't commit to this one because maybe there's another better one that would be out there. And so that's, again, kind of indicative of our society, where we are going. And not everybody. Not all people at this age are definitely doing that, but it perhaps is a reflection of we've shifted things later, and that the expectation that you have it all figured out is later.
Okay. So maybe we can expand on that. So what about the frustration that we're hearing from clients that the way the apps are setting up, allowing people to always think that it's a better partner so they can just, on the horizon, so they can just swipe? Do you think that impacts that?
I do. Right. Again, because the idea here, like you said, you used to meet someone in class, or maybe a friend set you up or something, and I think I read a statistic now that 60% of people now have met online. That is the norm. And so the part of the norm is my selection is bigger. And so that I just have that mindset that, I'm going to pick out 20 pairs of shoes or whatever, but then translate that into, we're a society that wants choice. And so if we translate that into our relationships, that could then have some negative impact. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. So let's talk about situationships. I've never heard of this. Amber's like the dating guru, so I was like, situationships. I've never heard of that. So I was like, so I'm seeing a larger period of talking before the relationship advances to a monogamous commitment, and so if it ever does, and so what do you feel like is playing a role in this change?
That's a good question. I don't know, other than maybe society changing the way that we look at what does it mean to be in a partnership. It's more okay to be non-exclusive, if that makes sense. That, again, previous mindset was you committed and then you stayed in that. Just in general, we see it's much more likely the divorce rates, the fact that a relationship is not always forever. Also, too, I see that with my students as well, that the idea that you used to commit to a business, that you got a job and you stayed with them for 25, 30 years, that's going by the wayside.
Right.
Yeah, and so I wonder if that same whole mindset, I talk to my students, like, I'll stay there for a couple of years and then, then I'll have to move on. Are we, and I don't know the answer to this, but are we possibly using that same philosophy toward our relationships?
Right. Like, I've heard it termed hookup culture, that there's a rise in hookup culture, and that the people are feeling more like they're looking for their next short-term relationship rather than their next long-term relationship, and they're not really looking at like long-term compatibility. It's just like, I'm going to swipe and find who I can hook up with next.
Right. And I expect nothing more than that. That's all. I'm good with that right now.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, most definitely.
So then let's just ask the next question. Are we moving away from long-term commitment as a society?
Evolutionarily, I don't think we will. I think that's such a huge part of who we. That would be a huge shift away. Evolutionary psychologists say that you have more success in raising our children when there's another partner to do it with you. I can't. That would be a huge, huge shift that we'd get away from it completely. But maybe it's just a difference in attitude. We still see that about 95% of people do choose a long-term partner. So, that statistic hasn't changed. We are getting married later. That we've definitely seen a change. I think I read the other day that men, it's average of 28 and women 26. Don't quote me on that. I'm not sure. But we are definitely we're choosing to have commitment later. And so that may be it. I don't know if it's going to go away. Maybe just a shift.
Sure. And there's a lot of positives in that, so it's not always a negative side. So
Right, yeah.
Excellent.
So I'm seeing online and just in general, not even just in Raleigh, but just in general, that the men on the apps outnumber the women like 5 to 1. Do you feel like women as a general are leaving the apps?
I might refer that one to Dr. Cundiff. I don't know if he has any more information on that one.
So I have to be honest, I'm not on top of all the dating apps
Or
or,
am I?
the trends or who is using them. But I mean, I could offer some perspectives on what we think are people's dating preferences. To Yeah, the apps. I don't have a good like hypothesis for why you might see a gender difference in the use of that.
Yeah, I don't necessarily know either, unless the mindset is if males see it as more of a hookup type of a thing, women less so they pull back because they don't want to be part of that. I don't know.
That's
That's
Right.
completely
I think
conjecture.
it depends like what types of apps you're talking about, right? Like if they are the swipe ones, then it's possible that it has to do with this idea of hookups. And there is a lot of stigma for women who are perceived as having sexual desire and having a lot of sexual partners, right? There's about 7 times more words in our lexicon to describe women who are who have a lot of sexual partners than we have to describe men.
Interesting.
And as you could probably guess, most of those words are very negative. So when there are words to describe men who have a lot of sexual partners, they're usually kind of more positive. So we even see the stigma in the language that we use, and people are aware of this stigma too. So, I mean, if it is an app that is geared towards casual hookups, then that could be why you see less women using those.
Well, I'm seeing what I'm seeing in like forums and like the following, because that's kind of where I gathered a lot of this from, is like what the trends I'm seeing, because I keep up with it as a clinician that kind of specializes in healthy relationships. And what I'm getting is that a lot of women don't feel safe on the apps. And so because there's a lot of risk of meeting a stranger, there's a lot of feeling of just a lot of rush to meet very quickly. And so what I'm seeing is a rise of these alternative methods of meeting. I know there's like these sub apps that are coming out that are like women hooking up other women with men, and like men in their lives that they know that are single. And it seems like women are either, from what I'm seeing, they're opting into those kind of like hooking each other up with people they trust and opting out of the apps. And so I was wondering if you guys had any feedback on that.
I mean, given the data of violence against women, I mean, there's also a lot of violence against men too, but the primary perpetrators of violence are men. So when men are experiencing violence, it's usually from male perpetrators. And when women are experiencing violence, it's from male perpetrators. And it can happen in intimate relationships. It can happen in, if you're maybe going on a date for a first time with someone, right? Like there are these different issues that a lot of women are thinking about in order to protect themselves. So yeah, that could definitely be a contributing factor to not wanting to use these apps. I'm even thinking about when you're selling something on Facebook Marketplace, and there's like little check marks you can say if you want to meet the person in a public place rather than at your home, and all of these things. And that's just, like selling a thing, as opposed to like going on a date with someone or meeting them at their house or something, so I could definitely imagine hesitation around dating.
Well, I think we live in an environment nowadays where we have to think about safety. And I think it's just a concern that we let, it's important to think about. So,
Right. So for those who want to do more than hook up, like statistically, you said 60% of people met their partners online. What are some of the other places that people are able to meet partners successfully outside of, they want something more serious and they want to meet people outside of a dating out, outside of that hookup culture, outside of the, the safety risks?
Does it go back to the good old fashioned way of that I know someone who knows someone, and you know I know you and I know this person, so we put them together. And again, if we're doing it later, that's going to take on an element of that as well. So I honestly don't really know what I mean. I know there's different apps with different intention behind them. As far as I understand, that if I would go on this app with the idea that I do want someone to commit to or the potential versus not. And so maybe that would be a way as well that I only would hope, and hopefully everyone is doing it in earnest, that I'm doing it with, I do have that intent. I'm not doing it with other intentions. So I would think so. I'm not really sure.
Well, I know we talk a lot about like making friends and making contacts and increasing our social circle, because the more we increase our social circle, then that involves meeting, because the primary people, the way I've seen it is the primary way that people meet partners outside of the apps is through connection with others. And so meeting other people outside of like the apps in our interest areas and doing the things in our normal life that we enjoy doing, then we expand that social circle. We increase the capabilities of us meeting people and forming connections in our real lives. And then, you know, making it known that, yeah, I'm looking for somebody that enjoys doing the same things that I do, that I might connect with. And then friends will naturally kind of put people together. It's kind of neat that way.
And what is a psychological principle that says that, you know, proximity, just spending time, and the fact that I joined this club, I'm going to have an interest with someone else who also joins that club, and that can then, because there's something behind attraction that if we like the same thing, be it we hate this class together, I mean, whatever that would be, we have this connection that will help me to perhaps do that way. And again, it's being social, putting yourself out there, maybe.
I think it's good to see, you know, students interacting in classes, because I know, you know, once they're interacting in classes, once they're interacting in clubs, that's where they're forming those social bonds, you know. And I love it how they're highlighting students who have met here on campus and they've, you know, they bonded. And so they've highlighted them on the eConnect.
Oh,
you know,
really?
have you watched this?
No,
No,
I
I
haven't
love
seen
it.
that.
So they've been highlighting them in the eConnect, and they've been students who've met here on campus. They've gotten married, and so that's just been fabulous, because it's like, you know, they've met somewhere here on campus, they've gotten married, their relationships have lasted, and so that's been highlighted over like the last couple of weeks here on campus, and so it's been a really neat, you know, show of like, this is where they met on campus. One of them proposed out on Havener on the steps. So it's like, you know, it's just, you know, becoming a part of campus, becoming part of social, you know, clubs and things like that. Those are things, you know, like where you've met your partner. I mean, heck, my husband and I met at Walmart when we were working. I mean, you can meet each other at your places of work. You can meet each other in college. There are just normalized places where you meet. I mean, we went to a murder mystery dinner theater you know, on Saturday, and they were having these social, you know, moments where you were connecting and like almost like doing speed dating. But like those are neat things that they actually still do now, you know. And they were going around and people were connecting and like, hey, where have you went? Have you done this? And what have you done? You know, and people were going around meeting, and it was neat to watch people, you know, for me, observing behavior, studying behavior. It's just neat watching people connect, and, you know, and there were people, total strangers, just meeting each other. And that, I think, you know, those are still places where people meet, you know, and so those are nice things to see people still doing. And you know, we need more things like that happening, I think. So
Exactly. I would like to add that I've been teaching for a very, very long time, and I've noticed a trend in, I would get to class early and there would be chittering and chattering and visiting, and even in the hallway. And because we have these wonderful cell phones, I'm seeing less of that. And so our opportunities to interact are, and if I am a shy person, I can hide behind, I don't have to interact. And so maybe I would have gotten to know the person next to me.
right.
And so there is that element that is missing or is different now.
Yeah. Well, and you know, you think about it, like on our cell phones, there's that missed element of emotion. So, you know, when you're talking behind a screen, you can't see, like we can see each other, so we see our emotions, we're able to engage. And behind that, there is the lack of emotion to connect.
Right.
And so when we're in person, you can emotionally connect with a person. And so that's the dating app too. you don't get to see
Right.
what the emotional connection is, which encourages that swiping, I think, too.
Right. Well, and there's this almost level between when we meet people online versus in person. Like there's a, almost like distance, and so that makes it a little easier to do things like ghosting and disengaging from a relationship rather quickly because it gives it that disposable air to
Good
it.
point, yeah. That's,
So there are a lot of emphasis placed on the fact that women want different things from a partner than men do. Do you feel like this is true?
Yeah, so I'm gonna push back a little bit on the word like of the fact that women want different things from a partner than men do. I think that we have a lot of stereotypes and expectations that is true, and I mean there is some research evidence. So there is a subfield of psychology called evolutionary psychology, and it looks at trying to identify some of these evolutionarily advantageous aspects of our psychology that might have helped us survive across time, right? So that idea of survival of the fittest, those types of traits and factors are going to withstand the test of time. And so when you apply it to human sexuality, you look at maybe the different reproductive challenges that women and men have had. And so from this perspective, the challenges for women have been that there's a greater investment of reproduction, right? Like you have 9 months of pregnancy, labor and delivery, breastfeeding, all of that. And you also have a limited number of eggs. So like you can only have a limited number of kids, right? And for men, the reproductive challenges instead are kind of less investment compared to women and unlimited sperm. And so this has created in evolutionary terms, quote unquote, men pair widely and women pair wisely. And so this is kind of giving this idea that women are more choosy than men, and so maybe they would have less partners than men would. But of course, this goes back to some of the stigma that we talked about earlier. So some of the evolutionary psychology research that's been done, there was one study that was a cross-cultural study across 37 different cultures on mate preferences. And so they surveyed people in all of these cultures and looked at gender differences in mate preferences. And what they found was that men said that they preferred mates that tended to have high reproductive capacity. So they preferred women who were younger and physically attractive, although there's also like some caveats about whether physical attractiveness actually correlates with fertility. But anyway, we're not going to address that right now. What they also found was that women on these surveys said that they preferred mates that had high resource potential. So these tended to be men who were older, so they had more status and power and had high income. But this study seemed to ignore some of the cultural context around these survey responses. So they weren't really paying attention to differences in women's and men's access to power. So the gender difference that we found in mate preference actually disappears when you take into account gender inequality in that culture. So as gender equality increases, gender differences in mate preferences actually decrease. So when women have access to power and status, then they don't necessarily prefer men who have access because they can get it themselves, right? So it's kind of like a compensation. I can't get it myself, so I'm going to prefer someone who can give me access to those resources that I need. Some other research also showed that these differences really only appear when people are talking about their ideal mates, but when people are talking about actual potential partners, there's no gender differences in mate preference in terms of physical attractiveness or status or things like that. And there's also no differences in people's current partners of what women and men preferred in their current partners. So there is this hypothesis, but it's not well supported by the actual research evidence that women and men are preferring different things in their partners.
So basically what people are saying is different than what the statistics are showing is true.
Yeah, and it also depends on whether you're living in a society where there's a lot of gender inequality versus more gender equality.
Gotcha. So I don't know if this is the exact right time to bring this up, but you were kind of talking about reproduction and men and women. But one of the students actually has a question, which I think is a really good question. The question was, what do you think about waiting until marriage? So I think this student is actually, wanting some input on this, and I think this is maybe a good thing for the panel, maybe to just throw this out there, because this, students, want to know. And over at in Student Wellbeing, we have the Black Bag Project, so this is something that, we, help students, if they need help and they're questioning, they just, safe sex practices, but they're wanting, students want to know, what does that look like for them? Because sometimes there's pressure, in not waiting, and then some people want to wait. And so what does that look like? What can we offer as advice to students about waiting till marriage? So what can we speak to them about?
Wow, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what can we say to them about waiting till marriage?
I think it's a really personal choice. Somebody has to look at their religious and moral values and make a decision on whether they feel like they want to wait till marriage for that experience. If I'm not mistaken, statistically, it does. There is a higher rate of successful marriages for those who do wait. But that also could be tied into religious stuff. And those that wait are more likely to be religious and thus more likely to stay married due to their religious beliefs. So it's, like I said, I think it's a very personal choice. Do you guys have any feedback on that?
I would say similarly, I think it is a very personal choice. There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. I think it's about being comfortable with your own choice rather than necessarily feeling pressured. I think it's also important that, having a partner who understands your choices, willing to respect your choice, I think is of utmost importance. I would say that I think to some extent, there are a lot of pressures in certain circles of waiting until marriage. And to some extent, those pressures can also set up unrealistic expectations of what that first sexual experience should be. So it's possible it could set up disappointment, or it could set up difficulty in achieving a positive sexual experience because you have suppressed any desires so far that it's then hard to let go when you get to that point after marriage. So, and I've seen that come up with stories that I've heard from some other people. So I think it is a personal choice, and there could be pros and cons either way.
Right. And again, I agree with what Dr. Cundiff said, the idea that we need to respect people's choices, whatever that may be. And it's very personal choice that I can't decide for you, nor, but again, I would think that would be a concern if you do have a partner who is, like Dr. Cundiff said, not willing to respect whatever your choice may be.
Right.
Right. And I think if you're a dating couple, you guys have to have mutual respect for each other. And if you make that decision together, then, you'll know at the right time when you're both ready, then you'll make that decision together. And so if you've made that decision to wait, then you respect each other and make that decision together. But if you guys have decided that you're ready to move forward together, then you move forward together. But if there's too much pressure, then one person within the relationship may decide that, hey, this isn't for me. But that's something, if you're feeling too much pressure in the relationship, then that's where, you may need to seek counseling too, and say, hey, I'm feeling too much pressure in this relationship. And so that's why student wellbeing is here too. If you need to reach out and speak to somebody, if maybe you're listening to this podcast from somewhere else, don't hesitate to reach out and speak to someone for support, because, sometimes when you're in a relationship and you feel too much pressure, there's times that lines get crossed, and you shouldn't feel too much pressure in a relationship to do something that you don't feel comfortable with. And I think that's very important. So, but if you guys have made a mutual decision to wait, that's great. But there can be times, like Dr. Cundiff said, that sometimes there's an expectation that gets set up that just creates a unrealistic expectation. So something to definitely think about. So,
And another thing, just to add developmentally, that if someone is making these decisions as a younger person, say a teenager, one of the biggest determiners of whether or not one will perhaps become sexually active with their partner is perceived, and I say that very loudly, perceived norms, that they may get the idea that everyone in my social circle is, so why not?
Right.
And a lot of times that the perception may not be the reality. And so then there may be, unfortunately, a pressure to go along with, even though I'm not okay with it, I may still do it because I believe that's what I need to be doing.
right.
I get that a lot in my individual sessions. We'll have individuals that feel shame because they still haven't had their first sexual experience in their 20s, or older, and they feel a lot of shame about that because of that perceived idea that everybody else is doing this,
Exactly.
I should be too. But then when you talk to people individually, you find out that they're not alone by far, and that there is a pushback of when dating is starting, like you mentioned earlier, and that you're getting more and more people that are having these that are in their early mid-20s and have never had a serious relationship and never had any sexual experiences.
So I think we're gonna move forward. I'm trying to remember where we left off. Amber, show me where we showed up, because there's another question here that I think is gonna be good that's gonna go along with where we're at with Dr. Cundiff. So I'm gonna wait for this question that's being posed next, but I wanna keep moving on because it's gonna go along with what this question's gonna be asked. So remind me where we were.
We're on this one.
This one, okay. So it seems to be an overall attitude that women are too picky and only want to attract bad boys. Is this true? And what's the underlying thing that's attracting women to men that are perceived as bad boys?
I don't actually know how true this is. I think you can find many movies that promote this idea, and we see it a lot in pop culture, that women actually want to be with bad boys. Yeah, I don't have any statistics to support one way or the other, but
That's what we're doing here. We're getting rid of some stereotypes.
Right, exactly, yeah. This question that is being posed is, what good can be found in classical gender roles in dating?
Was that posed by the student?
This is by the
What-
student, yeah. What good can be
good?
found in classical gender roles in dating?
I think first you have to define what are those classical gender roles, right? And so I'm assuming that the student is kind of talking about maybe those homemaker breadwinner roles in gendered relationships. And they're sorry, in my thoughts, I'm thinking a lot about some of our other questions that we have coming up, and there, I can definitely think of the downsides to traditional gender roles in relationships and how they can disadvantage both women and men towards having like a positive, fulfilling, satisfying relationship. When you're imposing these gender roles, they're creating kind of power and status differentials between the two people, which I think then makes it hard to really have a satisfying relationship. I mean, that's my personal opinion. So, yeah, like on the one hand, there can be value to what do you call it? Like just in general society, there can be an efficiency in having different people do different tasks, because then you get really good at those tasks and you become more efficient at it, right? And then someone else is really good at their task and they become efficient at it. And to some extent, gender roles will set you up to do different tasks within the home. But the gender roles are also determining what those tasks should be for women and men. And they may not necessarily line up with people's preferences or abilities or skills or things like that. And the differences of those tasks that we tend to assign in the gender roles also set up men to have more power and status and leisure time than they do for women. And so it sets up kind of this inequality within the relationship, which to me doesn't really isn't completely fulfilling and satisfying, or setting, you know, a groundwork for a really good relationship.
And I think one of the things I'll interject is communication is really important for a healthy relationship. That's something I see, like when I'm working with my students, when I've worked with couples, when I've worked with families. And so like in doing couples therapy, when I've worked with families and family therapy and I see those gender roles, that's one of the things we've broke down is like, okay, so who's doing the laundry? who's doing the cooking? You know, and so if it's somebody who's always saying, well, this person's just sitting doing nothing, how do we break that down? Where do we increase communication? And so if it is that gender role that's just typically, okay, well, mom's not doing the laundry, mom's not doing the cooking, and dad's doing all these things, how do we change that? Because typically, you know, it would be mom's always doing those things and dad's, you know, not doing those things. But I have had families where mom doesn't do those things and it creates a big, you know, upheaval in the family. So whereas we normally see that gender role assigned, but if it's flip-flopped, it can cause just as much difficulty in the family as whereas, you know, the opposite. So communication is the key in that family to where we say, how do we do those things equally? But I think this is that important part when someone's dating, is to say, if we're going into a relationship, this is 50-50.
Right.
Regardless of your gender role. It's like, if we're getting into a relationship, you know, we're doing the shopping together, we're going to do the cooking together, we're doing the cleaning together. And if we're going to develop a good relationship, I think that's where we do those things together. Because if we don't do those things together, your relationship's going to have more difficulty as you grow and develop a relationship.
Yeah, and I think it also goes beyond just like the division of labor within the home, but it's also you know, who is supporting who in terms of their career,
Right.
and is that benefiting both partners in the same way? Is it making one partner more vulnerable in terms of giving up different career opportunities, and now they're more dependent on their partner? So it can, create some inequities in that respect too,
Yeah.
beyond just a division of household work.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I think we spend a lot of time, like when we're looking at like our career, we spend years, you know, go to school, we research, you know, we try to figure out. But then when we look at a partner, like if you even look at like going back to the dating apps, they tend to match people on things like if they like pineapple on pizza and their political views. When we look at long-term compatibility, we're looking at more like, does this person prefer like traditional gender roles, or is this a person that prefers a 50-50 relationship? That's going to say far more about compatibility than if you prefer pineapple on pizza or not. So I think we're not looking at the right things when we're looking at compatibility. We've got to look at those core values and have those hard discussions while we're dating and say, okay, do you want kids? Do you want to work while you're taking, you know, while we're having kids young? Is one of the partners staying home? Which one? And having those hard conversations about division of labor early. I mean, not like your first date, but like
It should evolve into your relationship.
as the relationship progresses, when you start talking about marriage and a permanent relationship, those conversations definitely need to happen.
Right, because
And as long as they're both happy with it, then
right, because in long-term relationships, if one partner becomes ill and they were the breadwinner and the other person has to step up and take over being the person who carries the family is the person going to get depressed, get sad, get angry because the other person now is being the household, earner. And so because it will create that frustration of, oh, wait, I was the one who got my master's degree or my doctorate, and now I'm having to stay home and watch you earn the money. So how does those dynamics work, when that happens? And so are you okay being taken care of?
Right.
And so those are those hard conversations that you have. And those are things we don't think about having when we're dating, but it can happen. So those are tough. Okay, so moving right along. Sorry, the sidebar. So there seems to be a great deal of hostility in the dating world on both sides right now, too. We've seen, so there are men's movements like men going their own way, incel and red pill movements, and women's movements like Facebook pages dedicated to rooting out men they consider being dangerous or abusive. And are we dating the same guy? And then separate sites that these women set each other up to date. What do you feel like is behind this hostility?
So I think that on the one hand, the Facebook page that you mentioned that's started by women, it could be due to kind of this fear of safety issue, and it could be based on maybe some negative experiences that people have actually had where their safety was violated in some sort of way. So there's also, I'm going to question like how prevalent are these types of movements, and so I also want to make sure we're not like overstating how prevalent these types of movements are.
Sure.
From what I've seen in the literature, especially related to psychology of gender, is that these types of movements, especially I'm thinking of some of the ones that we mentioned here previously, like the red pill movement, incel, men going their own way, they're also rooted a lot in sexism, but also insecurity and also sense of entitlement. And so they can sometimes be, the members of these groups might have joined because they might have an experience where they feel like they've been rejected by a lot of dating partners. And people who are insecure, particularly sensitive to rejection, and have kind of a stronger reaction to being rejected. But then also we live in a society where men feel a bigger sense of entitlement to more types of things than women do. And I'm not just saying that, it's based on some experimental evidence. Like there's been some really interesting laboratory experiments looking at how much people feel entitled to pay for a particular task, and men think that they should be paid more than what women think they should be paid for that same exact task. But there's also entitlement in terms of relationship status. And so there's sorry, I'm going on like a lot of different things, but there's one thing that sociologists would talk about called hegemonic masculinity. So hegemony means something that's kind of like the kind of mainstream accepted default way of thinking. And so when you apply it to masculinity, it's these ideals of what makes a man. And those ideals include things related to having high power and status, and having access to female partners is part of demonstrating that high power and status. And so if you feel entitled to that, but you keep getting rejected, that's probably going to make you angry, right? And so I think that some of these movements are coming a little bit from that. Now, of course, like I said, I think that this is a very small subset of the population that I don't want to overstate how giving the impression that these movements are prevalent, because I don't think that they are, but they do describe some people. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So let's talk about, like, going off of that idea, let's talk about the Raleigh Princess syndrome. I feel like it's reflective of that hostility that we were talking about. Can you give a rundown of what that is and why those attitudes are that way?
Yeah, so I first came across this term when I first got to the university. Some of the students who were working in my research lab were talking about it. And so I thought, wow, what an interesting topic to study. So I I surveyed students to see how prevalent it was on campus, and about 70% of students had heard of the term. I think about half of the students had used the term to label someone else, and I think about a quarter of women had been labeled with the Raleigh Princess syndrome. So what is the Raleigh Princess syndrome? In case you haven't heard about it, it is a stereotype. So I just want to preface this with everything I'm saying isn't saying that it's a true description of someone. Instead, it's a stereotype. So it's a label that's used to describe a heterosexual woman who's perceived as using the small female to male ratio on campus to her advantage, by being overly selective when choosing a romantic partner, by manipulating men, by behaving arrogantly, that she's better than she really is. So basically, it's this perception that women are wielding sexual power over men by using their low availability on campus to manipulate and take advantage of men. So again, this is a stereotype, and specifically it's a derogatory term, or a slur that's really used in a hostile manner to insult and degrade women on campus. And my research showed that the people who were most likely to use this term to label women were people who endorsed what we call in psychology hostile sexism. So they endorse these really negative views of women and kind of have this perception of women as being sexual gatekeepers, as trying to take over power from men and that sort of thing. So when you operate from that perspective, that worldview, people higher in that worldview were more likely to use this term, Raleigh Princess syndrome, to label women on campus.
So can you explain the difference between hostile sexism and benevolent sexism?
Yeah, so hostile sexism is kind of like those negative attitudes towards women. It's probably what you normally think of when you think of the word sexism and someone being really negative towards women and having these negative views of women, as you know, that women are incompetent, they seek power over men, that type of thing. Benevolent sexism is kind of the opposite, where you have these really positive, warm views of women, but it also has a negative side. So you view women as being really warm and nurturing, and but they're also in need of protection because you see them as incompetent. So they can't really handle things on their own, so I need to cherish and protect them, but I think they're wonderful. So you put them on a pedestal, but you don't really respect them. Mm-hmm. So that's benevolent sexism. So benevolent sexism can actually, to some extent, be like really enticing because it's like, yeah, I want to be treated nice and warm and taken care of, but it also has that negative underside that you're not going to be respected and people are going to think you're incompetent and
Right.
you need help.
It's kind of like that pat on the head, like,
Yeah.
like, just go along.
Mm-hmm.
Don't worry your pretty little head, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So could we take a moment to look at the terms mansplaining and womansplaining and give some examples of each and how they affect relationships today?
I'm going to pause for just a second because I want to return to that student's question about gender roles in relationships, because
Okay.
I think that that's where hostile and benevolent sexism can really play a role. So, and hostile and benevolent sexism work together. We see that in countries that have higher rates of hostile sexism, you also have higher rates of endorsement of benevolent sexism. And part of that is because benevolent sexism offers protection from hostile sexism, because hostile sexism involves like violence against women and everything, and so benevolent sexism provides that protection. So you can also see it in relationships too, that obviously benevolent sexism would be better than having hostile sexism in your relationship. So women will sometimes endorse benevolent sexism to a large degree, but this can actually, and it's related to gender roles, and it puts women in a very kind of more support position. And you see that it's correlated with women's kind of being really oriented towards their relationship and supporting their partner and their partner's goals at the expense of their own goals. And it can actually make women really vulnerable. So to the extent that a woman might be really supporting her partner in achieving his career goals, well, then she might not have access to her own money and her own resources if that relationship ends up going sour, if he becomes abusive in some regard. That can just make it very difficult logistically to get out of that relationship. So thinking about how gender roles might actually create a vulnerable position could be important to consider. Anyway, sorry.
No, that's good, because what you were talking about leads to domestic violence. Yeah.
There's actually a big thing that kind of went viral this weekend about how somebody had posted on a Reddit forum about they had found their significant other's go bag, and they were insulted because they had a bag of items in case the relationship ever turned abusive, and to go to leave suddenly, like it had like $1,000 and some clothes and some stuff in it, and actually became like this whole controversy that I saw, like where people were talking, and it was just an interesting thought, like kind of going into what you were saying is that, it's the fact that a lot of women have that fear, that underlying fear, like what do I do if something happens like suddenly and this relationship does become violent? Like how do I make sure and keep myself safe? And it was eye-opening watching both sides, because you had a lot of men who felt that was a betrayal, like having that go bag, just having it showed a lack of trust. But then other women are like, well, there's, I've known people that everything was good until it wasn't. And then having that, it was interesting watching that interplay.
So one of the questions came back in, could you go back in and tell again what the benevolent sexism was, the definition? He was asking what that question was, so we can clarify that.
Yeah, so benevolent sexism are these seemingly positive attitudes towards women, that you think they're warm and friendly, and that they also need to be taken care of and protected. So it has this sense that at the core, women are actually incompetent and not capable of taking care of themselves. And so it seems really nice on the surface, but it has this underlying regard that you don't actually respect women. You think that they're nice and pretty and all those things, but you don't really respect them.
And they have their place. Would that be, yeah.
Yeah.
So we were the mansplaining and womansplaining. Can we take a moment to go back at the terms mansplaining and womansplaining and get some examples of each of what they are and how they really affect relationships today?
Yeah, so mansplaining is kind of the idea of a man explaining to a woman something that she already knows. And so it's it could kind of even be related to benevolent sexism, right? Like, oh, I'm trying to be really nice by providing all this information that I think you need, but I think you need it because I don't respect you and I think you're incompetent. So, like some examples that I've heard of would be like if you're at the gym and you're working out and you're lifting weights and a man comes over and tries to explain to you all the things that you're doing wrong and how you should, how to do it correctly. When then you also see him lift the weights and he's making all these mistakes himself. So, so it's kind of mansplaining, over-explaining something that someone already knows. So it's very condescending is the idea.
Yeah, because isn't the assumption that you need me to explain it to you because there's no way that you could possibly know this. Right.
Do you feel like that affects relationships? Like, and how the relationship dynamic? So.
Yeah, I mean, kind of underlying it is kind of this idea of disrespect. And I think within successful relationships, you need to have respect for each other. And it can, disrespect can come out in these sorts of ways, like being condescending, over-explaining things, right? So yeah, in that regard, I think it could definitely have an effect on relationships. And you mentioned communication is really important. And so this is like a negative type of communication.
Okay.
Right. When you were explaining that, I was just thinking of somebody who was thinking, you're inferior to me, and you just you're not smart enough. So because you're not smart enough, I've got to put you in your place and tell you what you need to do. So even though I can see you doing it, I've got to give you a better explanation to do it so you can do it my way.
Right.
Yeah.
And when I see that, I see there's a power differential there. And so when there's a power differential there, I see students in scenarios like that. I see a student who would come to me and say, I'm feeling belittled. I'm feeling like I'm not good enough. There's like I see students who, my self-worth's not good enough. I have self-image issues. And whether that's even male or female, because you get that from both directions. Women can do that to men can do that to women. So, you get that in that partner differential and you can go both ways, and so it can come from different directions.
Right.
A man can do that to a women can do that to a man. So, and that comes back to communication, and it's being encouraging to someone, and it's not being discouraging, and it's lifting people up. Hey, I really appreciate how you did that, versus the person going, ugh, I don't like the way you did that, or I think you could do it a better way. Let me show you how to do that, maybe you should do it my way, and I think when people hear you, encourage them and say, well, I really appreciate how you did that, and could you show me how to do that? It comes across a different way than when somebody says, well, I think I can show you how to do that and show you how to do it better.
Right.
When somebody hears you say that, there's a level of communication and a way you receive that and perceive it, that it goes and speaks to your personhood and helps you build you up. And so that goes to building a relationship. And so when it goes to building a relationship, that helps, the way people perceive themselves, but it also goes to how long a relationship I think is going to last too. So there's another question here, but I'm going to give it a few minutes because I don't know. It's not really appropriate right at this minute. So we'll keep going.
Okay. So do you feel like, actually, I think we already kind of talked about that one. So I'm going to skip down a little bit. So let's talk about dating profiles. Do you think psychology plays in a role in how we should write a dating profile? And what elements would you say would be the most important, like pictures, background information, etc.?
Well, I'm certainly not an expert in this by any means, but things have changed so that rather than things in a relationship just evolving and I get to know you and I disclose things as I see fit, I'm choosing before I even get to know you that I have to put something out there. And that's the implication, is that I'm going to have this perfect profile and it's going to attract the right people. And I think that's kind of setting yourself up to fail. That here, look at if I look pretty enough or handsome enough or whatever the word is, then I will get chosen.
Right.
And there is no magic button that's going to do that. And if people, and that's kind of a downside, I think, to the app, is this whole idea that I'm put on display and I can make myself look a certain way. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what you put on your profile, it's who you are in that relationship.
Right.
So I don't know.
That's kind of where I was going with that question.
Right, yeah,
Was
yeah.
because there seems to be this idea that you have to have a certain number of each kind of shots, and that you don't include this, don't use negative language. Like, there's people that sit around in these forums and they sit there and talk about how to set up your profile to get the
Yes.
most matches. But the
People do services.
Yes.
That I will help you set up the best profile, which to me is incredibly superficial. That is not going to set yourself up for long-term success if that's what you're after.
Right. Well, because I mean, think about it goes into those elements, those superficial elements, rather than those deeper elements, like we were talking about, those pieces that have true lasting connection, like,
Not pineapple on my pizza, right?
yeah, like we don't want to focus on the pineapple and the pizza. We want to focus on those true core values, and it just. That's kind of where I was going with that, was like, it just seems like people are too focused on having the right things.
I guess it's also, like, what type of person are you trying to attract? That might be a different, you might get different attractions depending on your profile, right? Like, if you're trying to make a perfect profile that is attractive to lots of different people, you still may not find your right person because you put out information that maybe is not accurately reflective
Correct.
of you or what you're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
So you might get a lot of, people who are contacting you, but none of them are right for you. because
Right.
They're going on information that is maybe not the right information that accurately reflects you and what you're looking for.
Right. And sometimes people don't put their true image because they're not comfortable with themselves.
Right.
And so that's that false image because they don't like the way they look. And so they put a false image because when they look at themselves, they don't like what they see. And so they have to put a fake image because what they see they're not comfortable with. And so when they put that out there, they go, I don't like the way I look. And so if I put this false image, then I will attract what I think will like that other person there. And so if they like that other person, then they'll have to like me. And then it's this whole deception of having
Yeah.
to push through that deception. And so that creates this whole web of lies.
Like this whole cardboard mask, like I'm gonna hold this up and I'm gonna make you think that I'm this person, and so you get a lot of filtered pictures. You get a lot of people that are, posting things like and genericness and stuff because they're not being authentic about who they are. Like, I mean, who doesn't? Like to have fun or like, but that's one of the questions is because you like look at these and they're like, I like to have fun. Well, who doesn't?
Right.
But we put that out because that's an easy answer that's going to get us, like you said, the most matches. But really, are we looking for the most matches or are we looking for the right matches? But we're afraid there's this almost like what I gather from a lot of people is that there's almost this fear of being authentic because if I'm authentic, then I'm cutting down the number of matches I'm getting.
Right. Well, and that's where supportive services do come in. So if you start identifying that, hey, I'm not comfortable with myself, then are there things I need to work on to become comfortable with myself? So,
Right.
yeah. So given all these challenges, what do you feel we should do about some of these things? Are there some solutions we can come up with? Maybe we should that we could like throw out there.
Well, as far as creating a profile or like dating or
All of it.
I actively
Solution people.
encourage people to meet people in their daily lives.
Right.
The apps are great; they have their place, but you meet people get to know people in your life. Those people will know people, and those people will know people, and those people will know people. That's how dating has been done since the beginning of time. And so, and that getting out there and meeting people and doing the things you love is going to connect you to other people that have the same, core values, those same core interests. Because we go online and we match after a picture, and that's great, but again, we're matching after a picture and a couple questions about our pineapple pizza preferences. And really, when we look at coming from, a marriage and family therapist, coming from this point of view, we're looking at these dynamics and the elements that they're asking in these questions, and most of them are not the elements that determine long-term compatibility. They have absolutely nothing to do with that. And so you're like, okay, so it's what's going to determine what a relationship's going to last. So if we're actually looking for long-term relationship success, you're frustrated with the apps and you feel like you're not getting anywhere, find the things you love to do, especially if your preferred gender is engaged in that activity as well, and do that activity.
Before I ask this last question, because I think this is a good one, what piece of insight I'm going to give you a minute to think about this. What piece of insight do you give a young person who's trying to find a partner but is feeling frustrated? I want you to think about this next question, because this is a question the student asked. This is going to be a good one for us to all think about. What do you think about joint versus separate bank accounts for married couples? This is a tough one. I love this question. So what do we all think about joint versus separate bank accounts for married couples?
Okay, I'll pop in here as the...
Amber's going to go on this one, so...
So I think this goes back to that personal choice thing, because you're going to have some people that grew up in homes that have been part of divorce at a very young age, or even in high school or whatever, and they've witnessed what happens when a couple goes to break up and the financial heartache that happens with that. So sometimes there is a feeling like, I don't want that for myself because I've seen how that affects other people, and so they want to keep that money separate. And that can be done in a healthy manner as long as there's communication and balance. If you are a couple that feels like you want to, immediately just put everything together, then that, as long as you're communicating and you are, come to that together, then that can absolutely be healthy too. But it's all about that communication and deciding what you are comfortable with and what you feel is best for your relationship. Not anybody else's, not Joe down the streets, not your best friend Steve, your relationship and what works in your dynamic. Now, what I see frequently, most generally, like in more modern times, I'm seeing a lot of couples that each one has their own checking account, and then they put money into a joint account, and that joint account is used for bills. That's most frequent what I'm seeing now. And that's just anecdotal of what I see when I've done marriage therapy.
I see that too. I think the biggest thing I see that though causes frustration, if there's not honesty in what each other has, then it's distrust. Distrust gets created. So if there's not honesty in what each other has, then it's like, what are you hiding? And so if there is an individual account that's kept and you're keeping how much you have over here and the other one's keeping how much they have over here and the other one doesn't know and you're frivolously spending, then is there going to be trust built in the relationship?
Right.
And so like Amber said, common is a lot of people what they do. So if you have a house and a car and you have common bills, you have those paid out of that. But then can you coexist with your own accounts and not create distrust? So some people have difficulty in doing that, but some people don't. So if that works for you and your partner, then by all means go for it. But if it doesn't, then maybe it's easier for others to keep one account. So you have to really figure out how that works for your family unit. So
Well, and you get some people that feel like that it should be 50-50, each person pays 50% of the bills, but if you have one person who's making 70% of the income and the other person has paying 30% of the bills, you have to ask yourself, is that equal? Is it equitable? Should we base how much each of us put in there by percentage of income that we earn? Is it fair that one person has no disposable income while the other person has a lot? There are a lot of factors in here, and like I said, it all comes down to communication. Unfortunately, in my experience with relationships, there's no blueprint that says that this is what's going to work. It's got to be what works for the couple.
And typically in marriages, what's mine's yours, what's yours is mine.
Fair.
That's the old theory. Whether that's your theory in your marriage, that's what you have to decide.
But I think maybe trying to look for too simplistic of an answer.
Right.
I think the danger in that is going in with the idea that this is the right way to do it.
Right.
Yes.
Yes.
And so I may not be open to the fact that that's not how you want to do it.
Yes.
And if we're truly a partnership, let's work this. What is it? And money is so loaded
Yes.
when it comes to relationships, and maybe that's where you came from. My parents never had this. My parents always had separate. And so you have to, again, I think sometimes when you are at the beginning of a relationship, like you're saying, is that it's romantic and wonderful, and I don't want to have a conversation that's going to get tough and icky. I just want it to be lovely and wonderful. But it's those conversations that you might have to have as to how are we, and my assumption, maybe I have this stereotypical view that, well, I just assumed that's what we would do because that's what my parents did, or that's what I saw happening. And so there's no one right answer. It has to work. And I can't look at your marriage or your relationship and say, well, that's wrong, because that works or doesn't work for you. It's not my place to say.
Yeah.
Right.
And as marriages evolve, so I know this question's probably coming forward because maybe you're thinking about marriage, or maybe you're married, I'm not sure. But tough questions come up in marriages.
Yeah.
They come up, and things may change. What you're doing now may not be what you're doing 5 years from now, a year from now, or 30 years from now.
Yeah.
Right.
So things change. And so you may come against a financial change, and you may have to do things differently.
Or a health crisis, like you
Health
said.
crisis comes, and so somebody may be impulsive in the relationship, and you may have to say, oh, let me have your credit card. That's not going to work anymore. Things change. And so you have to make hard decisions. But honesty, communication, talking, being open with each other, those are some of the best keys that people can do it. And when you hide things from one another, when you don't talk, and those are problems, those are difficulties people get into. And when somebody goes, hey, I think I would like to buy a new car, going out and buying the new car and not having that conversation with the spouse, that's the wrong decision.
Right.
Because that's going to get you in trouble. So, but hey, honey, I think we need a new car. Do we really need a new car? No, your car works just fine. New tires and oil change would be great. Those are the conversations you have. But that's when you openly have conversations and you make decisions together. So,
Well, and that goes back to that whole having those hard conversations like you were talking about, because being able, if you can have those while you're dating, then it makes it a whole lot easier to have those when you're married.
yep,
Yeah,
absolutely.
and it gives you practice too,
Yes.
and you
Yeah.
get to understand how that person deals with these hard moments.
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
I think that's part of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, and thinking about bank accounts, I think different people have different philosophies of money.
Yes.
And some people like to spend money a lot. Some people like to save money a lot. And so having that open communication and making sure that you and your partner are on the same page or at least understand each other. And maybe if you are on different pages, you have different accounts.
Absolutely, yeah. Think about your saving goals. Are you saving for retirement? Because are you getting life insurance? Because even though maybe you're 19, now you should have life insurance. And you're like, what? My 19-year-old said, you think I should have life insurance? Yes, you should. Why are you having this conversation with me, Mom? Because you should have life insurance right now. I don't need to have this conversation right now. Why not? So these are all these things. Are you planning for retirement right now? Why should I be planning for retirement right now? Because if you don't start planning for retirement right now, you're not going to have it when you get to turn 65. So these are all conversations you have now, even when you're thinking about dating, when you
Right.
seriously start dating, like not first date or anything. But
And there's also issues of like debt
yeah,
that maybe your partner might have.
Right, that bring to
And-
the relationship,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and probably having those conversations beforehand would be more helpful than like,
yeah. Does your partner have a dog and you have a cat, and can they get along?
yeah.
You know, all the things you really don't think about, but they are important. Do you sleep on the right side of the bed or the left side of the bed?
No, but debt is, you talk about separate bank accounts. I've known of couples where
Yes.
one brought in a considerable amount of debt to the relationship. And how do we handle that?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because if you come, I mean, this sounds petty, but if you have somebody who comes into the relationship with a credit score of under 500, and then you want to go to buy a house, you're going to have some difficulties. Not that you should say, I can't date you because you have a credit score of under 500. But I think these dating apps probably could give you problems with that, you know, so. But yeah, I'm just saying. So sorry that like really got on
No. These are again those important things we tend to focus on. Oh, this person shares this random hobby with me that I may or may not still do 5 years from now. Because believe it or not, the things that we like right now, you know, are not the same things that we're gonna like and be interested in 5 or 10 years from now. Like I don't watch the same TV shows or have the same hobbies I had in college. Like life changes, but we focus on those rather than the true metrics of compatibility, which are shared values, like saving versus spending, like you were talking about. Like those are the true metrics of compatibility.
Well, and spending time together and the things you do like, I mean, long-term like. And, you know, can you spend time together
Yes.
outside of what you're actually doing right now?
Yes.
So do you enjoy spending time sitting on the couch together? Can you go for a hike? You know, do you like being together for an entire week? Or is spending the entire week together too much? And you say, I can't stand spending a week with that person. You know, is it too much? Is it emotional overload? So it's looking at all those things, because if you can't stand spending a week with them, you're not going to want to live with them for an entire week or
Try
a year.
30 years.
Or 30 years.
Like, are you gonna?
So, yeah, I mean, you think about those things. Think outside the box, you know. And so if you're having those questions, those are good questions. So dating is the start of a lifelong, you know, relationship, which is a great place to be. So we've had some really good questions today.
So thank you for joining us today. If you have any additional topics or panels you'd like to see us covered, please let us know. You can email us or reach out. And if you haven't already checked out the Morning Cup of Joe podcast, we address mental health concerns that affect our students using pop culture to explain things in simple and relatable terms. We're available on Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and YouTube podcasts. Thank you again, and have a great day. Do you guys have any closing things you want to say before we close up?
No, thank you for having us. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, thank you guys, and we'll see you next week.
For more information about mental health and wellness, contact Student Wellbeing at 204 Norwood Hall. And you can also give us a call at 573-341-4211.
The song Happy Days is brought to us by music from www.free-stock-music.com. You can also add and follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook using our handle @S&T Wellbeing.